Okay, welcome back to the lecture on the real business cycle model. Hopefully you've seen the first lecture already, which means you are completely following along with everything, and we are now able to move on to the next section. So here we're going to be talking about the actors, or the optimizing agents within this particular economic model. What's going on here? Well, we have different actors, so like when I talked before about how we can think of some of these models like making a movie. Well, the first thing we need in a movie are actors. We need characters. We need to know what characters are in the movie, what their motivations are, why they're doing what they're doing. We need to know all of these things before we can go further, right? Because the plot is really going to be heavily dependent upon what these individual actors want. So we're thinking about a good drama, right? These actors, or these characters in the drama, are going to need some sort of motivation, and when we pit these actors against each other, not really the actors, I guess these characters, we pitch these characters against each other, then what we end up with is the plot, which is the drama, and as that plot resolves, we get an equilibrium. So before we go anywhere else in this model, we need to know who we're dealing with. We need to know who these characters are. Right? Well, basically, if you remember those, I think it was Verizon, but I could be wrong. Those commercials like, oh, you want this? There's an app for that. You want to do X, Y, and Z? There's an app for that. Well, just like that, only here it's you want this character to have this motivation, there's an equation for that. So the first one that we're going to look at are households. Now, we already kind of talked about these households. We already talked about what their motivations were. They like to consume. They don't like to work, which means they like to sit on their ass. But there needs to be some trade-off between the two where they can afford consumption but still be able to have enough time to sit on their ass so that they can enjoy sitting on their ass and then consuming those things that they had to work for. So, we get a couple of equations here for the household. Now, when these households optimize, we get two key equations. The first one is what's referred to as the Euler equation. Getting ahead of myself here. This Euler equation is an intertemporal link between current and future consumption. Now remember, we had utility of consumption, where utility would increase if we consumed more, decrease if we consumed less. And the Euler equation relates that through the marginal utility of current consumption, or U prime of CT, with the marginal utility of future consumption multiplied by beta. Remember, beta was our discount factor. So what beta is doing here is beta is discounting the marginal utility of tomorrow's consumption to be equal to today's consumption. But there's one other element here that we need in order to be able to get this Euler equation, and that's 1 plus this RT, which is the interest rate. Now, if you remember, the utility function for the household was this. All right, so the functional form was log utility. So, without getting too far into the calculus, the derivative of the natural log of consumption is just 1 over consumption. So the margin utility of future consumption would be 1 over future consumption, or 1 over CT plus 1. This Euler equation is just 1 over CT equals beta times 1 over CT plus 1 times 1 plus RT. So we've got our marginal utility that goes over time. This beta would be personal preferences, and this 1 plus RT reflects the state of the market. So you're probably like super confused, and I kind of don't blame you. So let's look at it this way. I'm going to erase some of this stuff here. So with our Euler equation, I'm going to erase this, because again, you don't need to know the formulation of this. You'll just need to know what the Euler equation is. Well, if we get this equation, first off, remember beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus rho, where rho is how patient you are. So first we're going to multiply both sides by CT plus 1. Which gives me this. So I've got future consumption over current consumption equals beta times 1 plus the interest rate. Now, beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus rho. So I'm just going to substitute that in. And that's going to give me 1 plus the interest rate divided by 1 plus my discount rate. Okay, so you probably don't think that this looks any better or any more clear, although I can tell you, in fact, that it's actually much more clear. And I will prove it to you. Let's look at what's just going on in this numerator. Well, CT plus 1's in the numerator here. The interest rate is in the numerator on the other side. CT is in the denominator, and this rho, or my discount rate, is also in the denominator. Now, if rho goes up, I get more impatient. means I want to consume more today and less tomorrow. So what I'll say is if rho increases, today's consumption is going to increase in order to maintain equality. So if consumption increases, because rho increased, all right, remember if the denominator gets bigger, then this whole thing is going to get smaller, which means this is going to get bigger, and then this CT plus 1 is going to drop. So I want to consume more today and less tomorrow. Now let's say the interest rate goes up. The interest rate goes up. According to this equation, what that means is, well, you're going to get more of an incentive to save. Because if interest rates are, say, 0, you've got 0 incentive to save. But if interest rates go up to, say, 10%, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I can get a lot of a return on investment if I just slow down my consumption today, because I may not be that happy today, or as happy as I want to be today, but I also do care about my happiness tomorrow. So if the interest rate goes up, I consume less today. I consume less because I saved more. So CT plus 1 will go up instead, meaning I consume more tomorrow. Penny saved is a penny earned. Now this Euler equation can be thought of in a slightly different format. Because there is uncertainty in this model, right? We don't know what the future is going to bring. So if we think about this uncertainty as being reflected in the interest rate, why would we do that? Well, I'm going to rewrite this. Think that the interest rate is a function of risk and uncertainty. You can price risk, you can't price uncertainty. So if the interest rate reflects risk and uncertainty, if uncertainty were to increase, right, because you're like, well, I don't know if we might be in a recession tomorrow. Right, so if you're worried about going into a recession tomorrow, you might lose your job. If you lose your job, well, you're going to want to make sure you've got some extra savings stored up in order to be able to get by without a job. Well, if you're scared you're going to lose your job, or you're scared something bad's going to happen in the future, you're going to save more today as a rainy day fund. So consumption today will drop, future consumption will increase. But at the same time, you can also think of it like this. This 1 plus the interest rate is equal to the marginal product of capital, which is the extra amount of output generated by adding one more unit of capital into the production function. Which was this. All right, so the marginal product of capital is equal to 1 plus the interest rate. So if you add one more unit of capital, and that boosts output by 5%, so I'll say if we add one more unit of capital and output goes up by 5%, then 1 plus that is just going to be 1 plus 0.05, which is equal to 1.05. Now, if I add more and more and more capital to production, then what happens, if we remember from the solo growth model, the output's increasing at a decreasing rate with respect to the input of capital. And at any point, we look at the rate of change, we would have these tangent lines. These tangent lines are the marginal products of capital. So if we add more capital, the marginal product of capital is going to decrease. By adding more capital into this production function, the marginal product of capital decreases. Therefore, we will end up saving less and consuming more. But if the marginal product of capital is high, meaning the actual input of capital into the production function is low, then that means we're going to be saving more to consume more tomorrow and saving less today. How does this work? Well, let's think about it. example. Let's say that current consumption is 1, rho is equal to 0.1, and the real interest rate is equal to 0.05. We want to know what future consumption is going to be. Well, we just plug and play. I got CT plus 1 over CT, which is equal to 1, equals 1 plus 0.05 divided by 1 plus 0.1. All right, well, I've got CT plus 1 equals 1.05 divided by 1.1. I don't even know why I wrote that. I think I was being a dummy. All right, well, CT plus 1 is equal to 1.05 divided by 1.1. What is that? Well, let me go to my trusty calculator, which you can't see. Well, consumption tomorrow is equal to 0.954. Which is less than current consumption, which is equal to 1. Meaning if the interest rate is less than our discount rate, future consumption will be less than current consumption. Now let's say the interest rate increases to 0.2. Well, let's assume for a minute current consumption is the same. So everything is the same except the interest rate has gone up. Well, now I've got 1.2 over 1.1. Right? What is that going to give me? Well, what that gives me is 1.09. That's the case, then holding current consumption constant, if the interest rate goes up, then we'll be consuming more tomorrow than we are today because we have more of an incentive to save. Now, in reality, the two, consumption today and consumption tomorrow, will be moving around a little bit more. However, we're only looking at one equation, so we can only really solve for one unknown. We can't solve for two. But the Euler equation, as we can see, is governing how we want to consume over time. Do I want to consume more tomorrow than I do today? or do I want to consume more today than I do tomorrow? This equation gives me that. So the Euler equation describes how the household consumes and saves, and it does so based on the interest rate, which is what is equal to the marginal product of capital. The more capital we add into production, the less that marginal product will be. So if the marginal product were to fall, then the necessity that the firm sees in saving or in investing more capital is reduced. Therefore, there's less of an incentive for the household to want to save. So the household goes, screw it, I'll consume more today than I will tomorrow. And that's governed by this Euler equation. So I'm going to rewrite the Euler equation in the way it was originally presented. But there's one other equation that we get. You get a labor supply equation. And it comes out to the wage rate is equal to theta divided by 1 minus the labor that's being supplied. So I've got LTS here, multiplied by consumption. And this wage rate is chosen exogenously. It's determined by the market. It's not determined by the household. So the household decides how much they want to work based on their preferences for sitting on their ass and how much they want to consume. So this is what's going to be governing how the household decides to work, which leads us to a very, 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 very important concept known as the reserve wage. And the reserve wage is actually a fairly easy concept to get, because all that it says is that it is some wage that induces you to work. Anything below the reserve wage, you don't want to work. Anything above the reserve wage, you do want to work. So a nice example of that would be, normally this is where I would be asking questions in class, but of course I can ask you all the questions I want, and you'll just be screaming at me through a screen that I won't be able to hear back from, so might as well not even ask you the question. But if I were to ask you the question, if I were to offer you a job at $1 an hour to grade papers for me, and I asked for a hand gesture that either was this, and I think we all know what that means, or I asked for a hand gesture that is this, and we all know what this means, at $1 an hour to grade exams, I'm more likely to get the first gesture than I am the second one. Why? Because you're like, dude, it's $1 an hour. Really? Why am I going to do that really awful, crappy work for you just for $1 an hour? That barely helps me. All right, if you work 12 hours, grade papers for me for 12 hours, okay, what's that going to get you? A meal at McDonald's? Like, whatever. But if I offer you, like, say, $20 an hour to grade those papers for me, all right, and then you work 12 hours, well, you get a lot more than just a meal at McDonald's if you're working for $20 an hour and you work 12 hours a day for me. Therefore, your reserve wage is probably going to be somewhere in between $1 an hour and $20 an hour. Let's assume the reserve wage is, say, $10 an hour. At below $10 an hour, it's just not worth it for you to work. But at above $10 an hour, or even at $10 an hour, you're like, okay, yeah, I think I'll work. So if this wage rate crosses the reserve wage, then boom, the household decides to work, they provide labor, and the higher the wage rate gets, the more labor they provide. Now, the labor they provide is a function of how much they enjoy sitting on their ass and how much they like to consume. So they still face that trade-off in this labor supply equation, which is what we see here. Let's think about this in terms, let's put this in terms of LT instead of W. All right, well, if we solve that out in terms of labor supply, so we're thinking about the hours that we want to work now. We're going to get 1 minus theta times CT. So the preferences of sitting on your ass multiplied by your consumption divided by the wage rate. What we see here now is if this wage rate goes up enough, we've got 1 minus this, if this wage rate were to increase to a certain amount, boom, all of a sudden you want to work more hours. So this guy's getting smaller, yes, because as the wage rate goes up, this fraction is going to get smaller. But remember, we've got 1 minus that fraction. So this goes from 1/4 up to 1/2, right? 1 minus 1/4, or 1 minus 1/2. So as the wage rate goes up, you want to supply more hours. So we've got the Euler equation, which describes the flow of consumption over time, and we've got labor supply, which describes how much labor is supplied each period. Now, the Euler equation is intertemporal, it's dynamic. This equation has a flow through time. However, if you look at the labor supply equation, there's nothing dynamic about it. Every single period, you are offered some wage, and you choose whether to work or not work based on what that wage is. There is nothing governing the expectation of what will happen in the future in terms of this labor supply. So labor supply is a static equation. However, the Euler equation is not. So that's just the household, right? But we also have the firm. Now for the firm, I'm not going to show you all this math. I'm just going to sort of tell you what they're going to get. Well, they're going to get labor demand. Why are they going to get labor demand? Well, they need labor to work. There's also investment demand. Labor demand is a function of wages and the real interest rate. Why is it a function of the real interest rate? Well, because the firm produces using labor and capital. If you were to increase the price of one, you're going to be affecting the amount of other that you're going to want to use. Therefore, if the real interest rate were to go up, the cost of using capital becomes relatively more expensive than the cost of using labor. Therefore, the firm will use a little bit more labor and a little bit less capital. So there needs to be some sort of substitution between these guys here. Meaning this labor demand is going to be a function of the real interest rate and wages. And it's decreasing in wages. Labor demand is not an upward sloping function. To the Bernie Sanders supporters out there, labor demand is not an upward sloping function. It's a downward sloping function. If you increase the wage rate, you're going to decrease the demand for labor. Now you've got investment demand, which is a function of interest rates. And wages. Again, decreasing in the interest rate. The interest rate goes up, investment demand is going to fall. Now I've got two other players I'm going to talk about. And then we're going to wrap up this section, and we'll start the next section. We've got government. Now in the government, or in this model, the government is exogenous. They make decisions totally outside of the model. They use what's referred to as lump sum taxes. So under a lump sum tax, everybody pays the same amount. Not the same rate, the same amount. So a flat tax would be everybody pays 10%. You're rich, you're poor, it doesn't matter, you pay 10%. That's a flat tax. Now, lump sum tax is everybody pays $100. Whether you're earning $5, $5 million, everybody pays $100. Now, lump sum taxes are collected they're used for stuff like infrastructure. But what they're not used for is to influence the business cycle. Taxes or borrowing by issuing bonds, etc., any form of spending this government chooses to engage in is not going to be used to influence the business cycle. Now, why is it not going to be used to influence the business cycle? Because it can't. It can't, the government knows that, so they just don't mess with it. Right, but there are still other government programs, government projects that are being funded. So you could even have a little bit of a wealth redistribution thing in the event that all households and all firms weren't exactly the same. But they are exactly the same, so it doesn't really matter. However, if they weren't, you could have something like that, but it wouldn't be used to influence the business cycle. So you can have fiscal policy measures that aren't what we call countercyclical. So fiscal policy that isn't countercyclical would just be, Social Security, food stamps, stuff like that. Any sort of funding for stuff that there is no market. So public parks, for example, or military spending, defense spending, the police, fire department, things like that. right? That would have to be funded, and in this model, it would be funded through lump sum taxes, which get collected. However, those expenditures are not ever to be used for influencing the business cycle. I want to make sure that's perfectly clear. Now, finally, we have the monetary authority, or the central bank. And what they do is they just set money supply to equal money demand, which is done to provide liquidity to the markets as it's needed. So what's liquidity? Well, liquidity is simply how quickly an asset can be converted into cash. The quicker and more easily an asset can be converted into cash, the more liquid it becomes. So they're ultimately just converting certain types of assets into cash, or converting cash into certain types of assets to provide liquidity or money supply to meet the demand for money. That's all they do. So there's no use of monetary policy to affect the business cycle. So neither the government nor the central bank operate to impact the business cycle or influence it in any way, shape, or form, because they can't. We've got monetary neutrality and we've got Ricardian equivalence, as well as perfectly flexible prices. And both welfare theorems of economics are satisfied. Therefore, every equilibrium in this model is perfectly efficient. If every equilibrium is efficient, we can't improve upon it without making somebody else or some other sector of the economy worse off. Therefore, any redistribution from the government or any use of monetary policy is going to have no real effect in the economy. And that will wrap up this particular section of this model.